Good evening. I'm Bruce Roeder, president of the Museum of Political Corruption, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our third annual Nellie Bly Award for Investigative Reporting ceremony and roundtable panel. Well, this isn't the weather I promised, Jim. I thought the Albany forecast this morning would be, as it usually is, 80% chance of kickbacks with a likelihood of significant accumulation. But be that as it may, I thank you all for coming out. We have a very special program in store for you this evening as we honor an outstanding investigative journalist, Jim Heaney, editor and executive director of Investigative Post. In describing Jim's contributions, I can't put it any better than Susan Arbetter did when she said, Jim Heaney went out of his way to create a nonprofit outlet devoted to the deep, consequential reporting that makes the world a better place. Democracy in New York is healthier thanks to Heaney and his small but fearless band of reporters. As part of this evening's tribute, we've assembled a tremendous panel to offer a timely discussion on Jim's work and on politics and the press in general. Since our last Nellie Bly ceremony, we at the Museum of Political Corruption have been busy. In May, we partnered with the Times Union to offer an informative symposium on rebuilding ethics in New York State. Over the summer, through the International Center of the Capital Region, we had the opportunity to work with not one, but two distinguished international delegations who were interested in our approach to anti-corruption education and civic empowerment. In so many ways, including tonight's program, the Museum of Political Corruption continues to represent our Albany community as a leader in promoting ethical governance. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, we've named this award for a very special individual. In 1888, the intrepid reporter Nellie Bly was offered $1,250 to buy the New York State legislature to kill a particular bill. While $1,250 may not sound like a lot to you and me in today's dollars, in 1888, it's clear to imagine the first thing Nellie Bly said to herself, wow, that's a lot of ziti. Of course, Nellie didn't pay the money, but rather wrote about her experience in a scathing expose for her paper, The New York World. So to honor her, we have set the award at $1,250. What you may not know, however, is the method we use to present the prize. True to form, we literally present it under the table, and I'm pleased to report that this year, the tradition has been upheld. Tonight, we honor Nellie Bly, and we recognize the vital work that Jim, his colleagues at Investigative Post, and reporters everywhere do to inform the public, often under difficult circumstances. We thank them, and we need them because they give us the information we need to conduct our oversight responsibilities over our government. But to really honor Jim and what his colleagues do, we as consumers of media must meet Jim and his colleagues halfway. We do this through education and media literacy. This is also a part of the mission of our museum, a mission that acknowledges that media literacy and civics education must be thoroughly taught to our students to prepare them to be the next generation of voters and leaders. And with that, I will get off of my soapbox. You know, some get on their soapbox for self-aggrandizement. I get on my soapbox simply to experience normal height. So, let me conclude by thanking those individuals who helped make this amazing event possible. First, I'd like to thank a visionary leader of our community who wishes to remain anonymous, but who provided a major gift to support this evening's program. A thank you to our award selection committee, Maeve Tuer, Frank Anacarico, Rosemary Armeo, Isaac Matzner, Carol Kamen, Susan Weber, Susan Arbetter, and our committee chair, Thomas Bass. I'd also like to thank Thomas for spearheading the funding efforts for this evening's event. Eve Brewer, who organized our original Kickstarter campaign, and the students in Albany's journalism program who filmed and put online this year's campaign. This has been a marvelous opportunity for students to get involved, and I'm pleased to also recognize Megan Collins and Kayla D'Amico from the College of St. Rose Communications Department for their public relations work for our event. A special thanks goes out to Rosemary Armeo for helping with Jim's very busy itinerary today. Perhaps you caught him on WAMC's Roundtable this morning. Also, a heartfelt thanks to the inexhaustible Susan Arbetter for being tonight's moderator and helping put this amazing panel together. Last but never least, thanks to all of you for your support and for coming out this evening. So with that, I'm delighted to turn the ceremony over to one of our founding trustees and committee chair, Thomas Bass.
Thank you very much, Bruce. It was great. So every year, the Museum of Political Corruption looks around. There's no shortage of corruption, that's for sure. That's the easy part of it. The hard part is to find somebody who's doing something about it. And in this case, it was Jim Heaney who was doing the hard work of investigative reporting, which is a difficult assignment. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money. It's not easy, and the Museum of Political Corruption is we're trying to put our finger on the scales of truth, justice, freedom, what used to be the American way, by giving an award to an investigative reporter who's doing exceptional work. And in this case, it certainly is Jim Heaney. He's been in the business, the news business, for over 40 years. And I'll detail some of his early experience, but he was at 25 of those years, he was at the Buffalo News. 6 of those years, he was at the Orlando Sentinel. And he was involved in journalism even before that. But then 7 years ago, he started this outfit called Investigative Post. And this is a nonprofit investigative journalism operation in Western New York. He should surely go statewide, so if any of you in the audience have some spare change in your donations this year, this is the time to make them. Heaney is, here's a long list of all the stories that he's broken over those 40 years in investigative reporting. And basically, he's an equal opportunity attack dog because whoever is involved in malfeasance, Heaney will go after them. And he's gone after slumlords, he's gone after the housing court, he's gone after public schools, graft corruption in the Thruway Authority, the New York Power Authority, Carl Palladino. The list goes on. I have 2 pages of it here, but Heaney's pretty well known here in Albany because he's the guy who broke the Buffalo Billions story. And he's the guy, Caballeros actually made the mistake of sending Heaney an email and saying that he was doing the work of a terrorist. And in Heaney's case, he was actually doing the work of investigative reporting. The 2 jobs are not to be confused. The Buffalo Billion, we're going to hear about this. I presume Susan's going to be asking all sorts of good questions about that. It's a wonderful story, how that unraveled, how it was revealed. I mean, when a reporter is able to, when the work of a reporter leads to convictions and people going to jail and being bumped off of their high horses, those are good days. And Heaney actually does not feel in the least sorry about that. In fact, he's very glad every time he bumps someone off of a high horse. And in fact, he said, I spent the day with him. He's a bit of an attack dog. I mean, he looks like a mild-mannered sort of fellow, but basically there's a fair amount of attack dog in him. And I'm going to conclude my brief remarks tonight by reading a little note here that Jim sent me in one of our email exchanges. When I asked him, how did you get into this business? And he wrote the following. I produced my first newspaper when I was 5 or 6 years old. I guess it was in my blood. It was either be a reporter or play center field for the New York Yankees, and that was not in the cards. Then Heaney lists the newspapers that he grew up reading, and there were at least 4 newspapers brought into the house every day, plus a couple dragged over the border from Canada. So the guy, news is important, staying on top of the news, figuring out what's happening, because there's a cascade of news around our ears nonstop, and Heaney's always looking to cover it. And then he concludes his note to me as follows, and for those of you young people in the audience might not know this, he's referring to the first impeachment inquiry into President number 37, which is of course a reference that we are now up to the impeachment inquiry for President number 45. And Heaney writes as follows in his note to me. Watergate broke while I was in high school, and I dug what Woodward and Bernstein were doing. Finally, I'm a rebel at heart and view journalism as a way to change the world. The other option was joining Che Guevara in the mountains of Bolivia, but then the CIA got him. I have lost none of my idealism about what journalism can accomplish. And on that note, and I think I'm supposed to provide you with a prize, a plaque.
Here you go.
And I think a handshake.
A photo op?
A photo op, I think. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the museum for the recognition. It makes me a little uncomfortable to hear people say nice things about me. I'm much more comfortable with somebody yelling and threatening me, but I'll take the compliments. Susan's gonna probably pepper me with questions. Usually Susan and she's in the plywood hut in the state capitol, and I'm sitting on my phone in my office in Buffalo, so this will be a little bit different, but rather than ramble on, because my wife's in the audience, who, Sandy, could you just wave? Come on, wave. She has to listen to me way too often, and so I will not ramble on, so she has to hear even more of me.
I knew instantly when I met Jim Heaney that he was going to be a pain in my ass, but that he was going to be a really good friend, ultimately. He's somebody who has always been there whenever the Capitol Press Room needs him, and has helped. I mean, he broke the Buffalo Billion story, which really, I think, was a turning point in the Cuomo administration. Why don't you share why you started getting interested in Alan Calieros and what he was up to with the bid rigging process, or the bid process, I should say.
When Cuomo announced the Buffalo Billion, actually the first major piece we did back in February of 2012 was an assessment of Cuomo's Buffalo Billion proposal as it stood then. And I contacted a lot of economic development officials around the country, really, to say, what do you think of this? Because it's unusual for government to pour $1 billion into a single community in the name of economic development. And I'll tell you, looking back, a year or two ago, I went back and read the original piece I did. And I can tell you that what the experts said should be done with $1 billion, the governor has done the exact opposite in terms of best practices. The worst practices were.
What do you mean?
Don't throw money, a lot of money, into a handful of projects. The state's spent over $750 million just on the Tesla plant in Buffalo alone. The cost per job is, in excess of $1 million a job. Jobs that, for the most part, are paying $15, $16 an hour. I mean, they're paying, minimum wage jobs. So it started with that, but that's the way Cuomo operates. He wants the big ticket projects that generate headlines, that make him look good. There's the headlines that come with with making the announcement, with the groundbreaking, with the ribbon cutting. And he gives, like a lot of politicians, sometimes we refer to it as economic development by press release. The objective isn't really, it'd be nice if we create some jobs and help the local economy, but the real objective is to look good. Let the politicians appear like they're doing something, even when they're not.
We had 3 announcements for the opening of Exit 3 on the Northway.
Yeah.
3. And the last one had reporters on these flatbed trucks. One of the reporters fell. It was quite a situation. But do you think that Cuomo is corrupt?
Yes. He escaped prosecution during the Calderos case, but anybody who follows Cuomo knows he's a control freak. Nothing goes on without his knowledge and approval. And to think that this scandal unfolded with him in the dark is worse than naive. It's disingenuous. And I think it continues. I don't think that he has learned his lessons. If anything, maybe he's a little bit more emboldened because he in a sense, he got away. He escaped prosecution in the Buffalo Billion trial. His reputation was sullied a little bit, but he just won re-election again in a landslide. And I have not seen a change in behavior or in policy.
So let's just get back to the Buffalo Billion for a minute. So when was the moment that you realized, ooh, I have a juicy scoop here? They made a mistake.
Yeah, I think the moment was, and I can remember pretty vividly, I had gotten a copy of the request for proposals for a developer to build this $700 million plus plant. And the RFP read that if you wanted to apply for the work, you had to have been a developer in Buffalo for 50 years, 50 years.
How many companies would have fulfilled that?
Well, I went to the public library and got the Business First Booker list, which listed, among other things, developers and contractors that have been, in one of the columns was incorporation date. And I looked, and there was only one developer who met the criteria. He had happened to have been awarded the contract. And he was one of the governor's largest campaign contributors in upstate New York. And at that moment, I thought, holy, you know what?
Ding, 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 ding.
And
what did you do? Did you do a dance?
no, I was in public library. I'm a terrible dancer anyways. You wouldn't want to see that.
You're right.
And it was, at that point, I knew I had something. And then the subsequent stonewalling kind of confirmed that I had something because the Cuomo people, Calderos and others, I've been a reporter for 40 years. I started when I was 3. I know I look older, but, and the stonewalling was unbelievable. And the one story I'll tell is, so I filed an FOI request with Fort Schuyler Management Corporation to get certain documents. And after months, they finally got back to me and said, we don't have these documents. So, well, who does have them? Oh, that would be the SUNY Research Foundation. All right, so who do I email? Who's the point of contact? And this attorney for Fort Schuyler says, I don't know. I'll have to look that up and get back to you. Well, he never got back to me, but I found out who the lawyer was. It was the lawyer who told me he didn't know who the lawyer was to send an FOI request to. And it was those games for like 6 months. And so
How do you get around that?
You be persistent, you be dogged, and people who do unethical things eventually are going to screw up and present an opportunity for a reporter if you stick with it to and in this case, the initial story was about that 50-year requirement. It was about a lack of transparency. And fortunately, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan read the stories and thought, And, you know, unlike investigative reporters, prosecutors have subpoena powers. And they went to work, and, you know, the result eventually was a lot of indictments and eventually convictions.
So eventually, the governor was not indicted. Were you surprised by that? And do we know why? I don't think we know why to this day.
I think I was a little disappointed, but not surprised, because for prosecutors to go after a standing governor is pretty unusual. The reason why I can only speculate. The reason why I'm quite confident that Cuomo was guilty of something is Cuomo is a control freak. Nothing happens in his administration of consequence that he doesn't know about and approve. And Carleros had inserted in his office one of Cuomo's top political aides. Well, that didn't happen by accident. Todd Howe was going to be the governor's eyes and ears to what was going on in the Buffalo Billion. So Andrew Cuomo knew what was going on. You have to assume he approved of what was going on, otherwise he would have put his foot down.
It's also interesting to note that Calleros didn't do any of this kind of stuff under other governors.
Not that we don't. Not that we know about.
Other governors also didn't produce the same kind of economic development monstrosities that Cuomo did.
The common wisdom is Carleros was insecure about losing his $1 million a year job with SUNY, and so he ingratiated himself with the governor by giving the governor all sorts of praise. He would routinely describe his economic development program as the governor's, and it was really Carleros' approach. And he
not just Calleros' approach, by the way. Pretty much all the commissioners at one time or another have done that.
Yeah, and he, I think he wanted to protect his position, and the way you do that is you do what you're told. There are other contractors on other Buffalo Billion projects in which they got a contract, followed up shortly with a call from the governor's fundraising committee suggesting campaign contributions in the tens of thousands of dollars.
You've covered other, you have been an investigative reporter with other administrations. Is this administration different from others in Albany?
Yes, in this sense. And it's true of not just state government, it's true of not just Andrew Cuomo. When I first started as a reporter, if you were working on a story and you wanted to talk to somebody, more often than not, you could pick up the phone and actually talk to the person who knew what was going on. And they would answer your questions and you do your story. Now it's very difficult to talk to anybody who actually knows what they're talking about. You're filtered, or you're sent into this world of public information officers, where everything goes through a PIO, and their job is to spin and, if necessary, obstruct. So getting the right people to talk to without interference is increasingly more difficult. In the Cuomo administration, it's almost impossible. The other thing is, if you needed a document back in the day, more often than not, you could call up the person who had the document, and you could get the document by simply asking. That's not the case anymore. At the local level and the state level, to say nothing of the federal level. They're going to ask you to file a FOI request. That FOI request is then used in a manner to delay the release of information. The law says the agency has to respond with an acknowledgement letter within 5 days. Usually what that involves is a letter saying, we're going to need more time. And I would say with state government, it typically takes months, sometimes years, to get documents that are in somebody's file cabinet that could be retrieved in 5 minutes. But there is a growing contempt on the part of government at all levels for the public's right to know. Politicians increasingly don't view the public record as the public's record. They view it as their records to use for their political benefit. And this is a battle that reporters are increasingly having to fight, and it's maybe the biggest challenge we have, particularly as investigative reporters, is getting documents in a timely fashion. So what you're confronted with is people who will not answer questions and will not provide documents. So it's tough. It happens, again, local government, but Cuomo has really kind of perfected the art of obstruction.
Is there anything else you'd like to share before we bring some of the other reporters up here? How'd you sleep last night?
We're a nonprofit investigative reporting center, and let me talk for a minute about that. As newspapers downsize, the expensive kind of work tends to be the work that suffers. There are fewer reporters. There's tens of thousands of fewer reporters working at daily newspapers than there were a generation ago. The result of that is there's less, at a time where we need more investigative reporting, we have less. At a time when we have more government obstruction, we have fewer reporters to try and deal with that. And to fill that void, in part, nonprofit news organizations really started to take off about 10 years ago. And it's a growth industry in a media world that is not growing otherwise, unless you want to count the nonsense that's on cable news, be it Fox or CNN or MSNBC. It's all noise. And I think a lot of people are unhappy with the media, not because of the job reporters are doing, reporting straight news, but it's all the talking heads and noise that people are subjected to after 7 o'clock in the evening, Monday through Friday.
So we should note that through the end of the year, anybody who donates to Investigative Post, their donation will be matched by an organization called Newsmatch. What is Newsmatch?
It's a consortium of 7 different foundations, national foundations, including the Knight Foundation, Ethics and Excellence in Journalism, and they will match donations of up to $1,000, which helps prime the pump, because people like to give when they know every dollar they give is going to really be $2. So that's a program available to all news nonprofits. When we started Investigative Post, there were about 50 nonprofits in the country. There are now about 250.
That's amazing.
So it's growing, but it's a slow slog, because people are used to giving to their hospital, their alma mater, their SPCA. We're still trying to get people used to the idea of donating for journalism. It's a new concept, and frankly, some people, run toward it and embrace it, and others run away from it, and because it's not everybody's cup of tea. But it's so I think nonprofits around the country are really reliant on community support. It's not advertisers, it's not car dealers, it's just average folks that see the value in what reporters do and want to see that value that reporting enough that they're willing to put their money where their mouth is.
So investigativepost.org. Let's give Jim a hand. The idea here with this mix of policy experts and investigative journalists is to discuss how investigative journalism and people who make policy can work together to make effective change. And the people that you see up here, all of their bios are in the book that you received, but Blair Horner, 40 years looking to change the ethics landscape in Albany. That's fair, right?
I don't know. It's sort of depressing when you put that.
Yeah, you get an F, Blair, okay? You get an F.
So we have Jim Heaney, who you know, Judith Ank is the environmental czar. She was the regional administrator of the EPA. She's now teaching at Bennington College. Very integral in the investigation into Hoosick Falls water contamination that we're going to talk about. Brendan Lyons, who is sort of an institution around here, has broken all kinds of stories, and we're going to be talking about some of them. And of course, John Campbell, who, if you know anything about, for example, the signs on the thruway that are really, really busy that needed to be removed, he really single-handedly got those removed. Are they all removed yet, John? It's a long story. Anyway, these are the people behind the investigations that matter to all of us. And I thought what we could do is talk about how the process works and what we can do to ensure that we continue holding government accountable. And then we'll take questions. But I wanted to start with the Buffalo Billion and because we're honoring Jim tonight. So Blair, you have been pressing the state legislature on ethics for a long time. How did the bid rigging and bribery case stemming from the Buffalo Billion move the needle on ethics? Has everything changed in Albany? Is it a new day?
Everything's perfect, everything's fine, anything you read in the paper is wrong. Unfortunately, I mean, when it came, there was, as you all know, this raft of scandals across state government that led to the conviction of the Senate Majority Leader, the Speaker of the Assembly, scores of legislators, and in the Buffalo Billion case, top aides to the governor and big campaign contributors all ended up going off to the who's gal. The only sort of needle that moved was that bad things that had been done in 2011 to, for example, make it harder for the state comptroller to monitor contracts, some of those powers were restored. And so, unfortunately, while there was a political earthquake, the fact that Preet Bharara ends up getting canned around the time that all this stuff was going down. And one of the sort of top observations I'm going to have about this throughout the night is the fact that there was independent enforcement of the law is really what made the difference in the case of the Buffalo Billion. Jim and his team did a great job getting the story written, but it's because the U.S. Attorney's Office picked up the story and decided to do something about it that anything really ultimately happened. And the fact, this is not a comment on the guy who's there now, but Bharara obviously felt like he had to do something about it and did. And if you listen to Bharara talk, he extols often the importance of independent journalism to finding the stories that people like him could deal with. But it didn't really change much in terms of Albany. If anything, the executive, the governor, is more powerful than he was before the scandals broke because the legislature is weaker. And the major reform, quote unquote, was a sort of restoration of the powers that the comptroller had before the scandal happened. So there's much more that needs to be done, and I have 40 more years to do it.
But also, I don't think that the powers of the comptroller were restored in statute, were they? They're just like this.
Yeah, there's some sort of agreement.
There's a little agreement between the governor and
right. It didn't make its way into law.
That may change this legislative session.
Well, we're going to keep pushing for it. The problem is the governor's so powerful in New York State, the legislature's unwilling to buck him. And if he digs in on a particular topic, and in the case of the comptroller's powers, there was majorities of both houses that supported the legislation, original legislation. It couldn't get passed because the governor put his thumb on the scale. So he didn't want it to happen. And if he doesn't, in the way New York is set up, the governor is the political King Kong. The legislature is often unwilling to take him on. And when it comes to issues of the executive's power, they're not willing to do that. And so it played out that way, that the comptroller's powers, that's why I said partially restored, are partially restored on a piece of paper.
So Blair said something interesting about the Preet Bharara and his willingness to go after the wrongdoers in this particular case. Brendan, when the Times Union was doing all of those pieces on NXIVM, how frustrating was it for you that the same people of subpoena power weren't doing anything? They were just sort of ignoring it.
Yeah, it's interesting that, you know, state government corruption was being corrected by the Southern District, the Manhattan U.S. Attorney. And we've seen that through the years here in that the Northern District, to some extent the Western District, there's 3 federal districts in the state, or 4, actually the Eastern District too. But the Northern District in Albany has earned its reputation for sitting on its hands. Whether it was the NXIVM cult, where the Times Union in 2012 laid out evidence of you know, children being sexually abused, of kidnapping plots, all these different things that the Northern District never latched onto. It's still amazing to me that even the Buffalo Billion, which the nexus of all that started here in Albany, and again, it was the Southern District that came in and blew that up. And the Northern District often will explain that away by saying, well, it's an issue of resources. The big offices have the resources to do these cases. But the people in the trenches say that's not true. If you have a meaningful case, they'll give you the resources you need. The Main Justice will send them to you. So, you know, and you saw the same thing with NXIVM.
Yeah. Also for Brendan, the Cuomo administration was at the center of one of the investigations that you did on DCJS. There was a person who was at the head of DCJS who was found to have threatened female employees with physical violence, I think, amongst other things. He was a sexual harasser. He was a serial bad person. And he was never disciplined by the agency, but the women who complained were. Tell us what happened and how the Cuomo administration responded.
That was a case that I think normally would never be made public, would never see the light of day. It was a case where the Inspector General's office was into DCJS and investigating a failure in a criminal case involving manipulation of evidence and DNA on a murder case. And DCJS is the caretaker of the DNA system. And during that investigation, one of the workers talked about the environment and described the sexual harassment. And the agency itself had already, in large part, buried this and relocated some of the workers and did things. And so the Inspector General launched an investigation of these allegations and affirmed them and issued a report to DCJS saying that we've conducted all of these interviews. We believe that this person who's the director of your DNA forensic unit, in fact, did all of these terrible things. And the response from the agency was to say, well, we'll do our own investigation now. We're going to ignore what you, the IG, found. And that investigation resulted in there was a female attorney who was simply a cooperating witness. She was asked to testify and did. And the head of the agency was given her tape recorded and a transcript of her testimony, brought her to his office and started playing her testimony, saying, why did you say that? Why did you say this? And then they handed her her termination letter. And the woman who was the subject of some of the abuse was then moved from her corner office into a former closet in a different unit where she did not want to work. And the only response I've ever gotten from the governor on that case was, I'm not familiar with that. I'll have to get up to speed on that. And so, but it was an egregious case of sexual harassment and cover-up. And I might add that in a pattern, is it a pattern? Possibly. You wait 8 months. And usually you see the messenger of that news suddenly, and you saw Catherine Leahy Scott just, you know, not long after that, suddenly pushed aside and now is a court of claims judge. So.
Wow. So at what point as an investigative reporter do you say, you know what, I'm never going to get any further with this story, so I'm just going to give it up?
You know, that can happen. In this case, the difference in my reporting was a low-level DCJS worker who had the courage to take photographs of that IG report that were left on a desk. And had that never happened, that story never would have been told, probably.
That's amazing. The real meat of investigative reporting, I think, takes place when the administration stonewalls. You have to have, Jim, all these different kinds of tools in your toolkit, I think, to be able to work around that. Can you share what some of those tools are with us?
Well, it starts with just having sources, people who can tell you what they know, people who have access to documents that are willing to leak them, people who can kind of paint the big picture that becomes a roadmap for the reporting that you do. So, documents are important, web research is important, but I think human intelligence is still probably the most important thing for investigating any kind of reporting. You have to have people talking to you, and it's usually not the person at the top, it's probably the person at the bottom.
This leads to something I want to ask Judith, who worked in both state government and federal government. And you're supposed to have ethics training, I believe, on both levels. What were your ethics training in both positions?
So I was a political appointee in the Obama administration. I would like to say I miss no drama Obama every day. And we got standard ethics training at EPA, but I think the most important thing was my first month as a political appointee in the federal government. A lot of the early political appointees were invited to the White House for a day-long orientation. It was administrators, regional administrators, etc. And the most time that day was spent on the importance of ethics, and that President Obama did not want one ethical scandal to happen during his administration, and he succeeded at that. And I remember very vividly an assistant counsel in the White House counsel's office got up and said, "You're all political appointees, so by definition, politicians are going to call you. And sometimes they're going to ask you to do things that you shouldn't do. If anything like that happens, if your radar goes up at all, call me immediately. Here's my home number, here's my desk number, and I will help you navigate this." That was a very powerful message to all of us. I never heard that message when I worked in state government. And the good news is I never had to call that guy, because each time when I felt like I was being tremendously politically pressured to do something that wasn't right, it was so obvious that I didn't have to call him. I just kind of stood up and said no. And I will add that while at EPA, I had the privilege of working with 4 different governors: New York, Cuomo; New Jersey, Christie; Puerto Rico, a couple different governors, and US Virgin Islands, a couple different governors. And the administration that I had the most difficulty with was not the Christie administration. It was the Cuomo administration.
Well, okay, so tell us.
No, I'm done.
No, I would love to hear, the Hoosick Falls water contamination situation at the very beginning was very scary. I remember it was like in December or January, there was this trickling out of information, but the administration wasn't the one doing the trickling. You were.
Well, it was Brendan.
You and Brendan. Yeah.
It was just Brendan. He had it first. Brendan did an amazing job covering this, along with Scott Waldman, who was at Politico at the time. And we kind of, I think, discovered it about the same time. But the way I found out was the Rensselaer County executive called me up and asked, did I have $3 million to give the village of Hoosick Falls to install a carbon filtration system? And because EPA funds improvements to clean drinking water. And I said, well, we have this whole, very structured process. I can't just find $3 million on my desk. I think my discretionary funding was $5,000, which I mostly spent on books and only spent like $200, because I am a fiscal conservative, for the record. So I said, well, what's wrong with the Hoosick Falls water? And she told me that it was contaminated with PFOA. It's the first time I ever heard that. So I instantly called the state health department, and they said, oh yes, it is contaminated, and we've been meeting with the company for a long time to try to get them to provide bottled water. I said, how long have you been meeting with them? Because these are very high levels. And they said 18 months. And I almost dropped the phone, because that meant people were drinking contaminated water for 18 months. The mayor of Hoosick Falls knew about it, the New York State Health Department knew about it, and they wouldn't tell the public. And the thing that was so important was the Times Union diligent coverage of this and Politico's coverage of this that finally kind of moved the story along. But you probably have more to add, Brendan.
I just remembered, there was sporadic coverage of it. There might be a television reporter at a village meeting and, about a meeting tonight about there's a chemical in the water. And so I started driving out there and going to the meetings and checking things out. And it became quickly evident that the story wasn't being told. The story was that the villagers were being misled and lied to, and that people potentially had been dying from rare forms of cancer. And so there were people in the village doctor, Michael Hickey, who really did move the needle on his own, who were afraid to come out in the spotlight. And getting the story was just a matter of sitting in their kitchens with them and convincing them it's time that we tell this whole story. And but during the reporting, before our first story came out that December, in mid-December, that a danger lurks below. And that was the one that seemed to sound the alarm that no one could ignore, after that. But the FOIL request, the Freedom of Information request, before that and through probably the next year and a half, revealed this systemic effort to cover up. In fact, the health department's advice at one point to the village was, actually, you're not obligated to disclose this chemical because it's not on the list, so you don't have to do anything.
So, yeah, I never understood that. I mean, you know that it's a carcinogen.
Yes.
So, but why?
Unregulated, right? So.
But it's unregulated. So what does that mean?
It's an emerging contaminant. So EPA has a health advisory number, which everyone always used, even though it was technically not a drinking water standard. But the important thing is the New York State Health Department, who continues to drop the ball on every single environmental health issue that gets to their table, didn't want to tell the public. The mayor didn't want to alarm the public. I urged them to inform the public. They wouldn't, so I did. I told the people of Hoosick Falls to stop drinking the water, and the response from the Cuomo administration was not to cooperate, get the alternate water supply. It was to attack the EPA.
Yeah, they were angry with you.
A little bit, just a little.
And that wasn't the first time. But we'll get back to that in a second. I wanted to bring John Campbell into this conversation. One of the, I guess the mission of journalism, they say, is to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. But there's another part of it too, and that's holding powerful people accountable when they do really stupid things. And that's what happened with Senator Fred Akshar. This is one of the most powerful Republican senators in the southern tier, and somehow you got wind of some wrongdoing. Why don't you take it from here?
Well, it started a little before what you're referring to here, and that was, I'd gotten tipped off that he was dating a member of his staff, and well, there you go. So I checked into that, and one of the first things I did was look at payroll records, and you can guess what it showed. Her salary had more than doubled, almost tripled during her time in his office. He was only elected in 2015, I believe. And so I had written a story about that. They since got married, and in name only, they took her off of his payroll and put her on the Senate Republican payroll, where she still works on the same floor as his, in his office in Binghamton.
Blair, is that legal?
Yes.
There was in doing that story, you know, there was no Senate rule against dating a member of your direct employ. There is, I mean, you saw things this week, like the CEO of McDonald's stepped down because he had a consensual relationship with one of his employees. Well, neither here nor there. But that led to another tip that he had, that Fred Akshar, the state senator who runs the Senate, still to this day runs the Senate Republicans' campaign operations, their political operations. I got a tip that while he was the Broome County undersheriff, which he was right before he was elected senator, he had some sort of relationship with the mother of a murder victim whose case that he had investigated. And that hadn't become public. And I checked around a little bit there, and I couldn't confirm it. I tried to reach out to the woman and wasn't able to get in touch. But then a few months later, the woman posted something about it on Facebook. And that was all I needed to go to the senator, ask him about it. He confirmed, he called it a brief consensual relationship. She, you know, hated that description. You know, she said it was more of a drunken encounter, and that led to another. And it happened that the senator testified in the first trial of the murder, that the the encounter, the relationship, whatever you want to call it, happened in between the first trial, which then the conviction was thrown out, and there was a second trial, and he did not testify in the second trial. The lawyers wouldn't talk, and his case is still on appeal now about why they did not call him to testify. So it's, but he does remain, he is the head of the Senate Republican campaign.
There's also another story that you broke, John, that had to do with somebody who the entire state press corps held in high esteem for a long time. And we found out that we perhaps shouldn't be holding people in such high esteem.
You're referring to Robert Freeman,
yeah,
who was the head of the Committee on Open Government, and that was an interesting situation. What happened there was, I write for the USA Today network, which includes 6 papers across New York. A reporter, a young female reporter from one of our papers, had a terrible encounter with Mr. Freeman, who was a go-to source for anybody in journalism. Every single one of us at this table had come into contact with him professionally at one time or another. And he would advise you. He was kind of an ombudsman of sort. He would advise you on how to get documents, how public meeting laws, etc., etc. One of our young female reporters, he invited her to a lunch meeting. She had sought his advice on open meetings laws, and while there, he made uncomfortable comments about her race, about her appearance, about any number of things, and then to the point where he she stood up and he put his arm on the small of her back and around her hip to lead her out, and he at one point took her face in both hands and planted a kiss right next to the lips, right just shy of her lips. And to her credit, the reporter's name is Aisha Powell. She filed a complaint with both the Clarkson Police Department, Westchester County Police Department, and the State Inspector General's office. That led to an investigation where he was fired. My colleague Joe Spector broke the story about him being fired, and then we set out to find out if there were any other victims. Almost immediately, we started hearing whispers here and there. We ultimately found 8 women on the record who described very similar, uncomfortable instances of harassment by Mr. Freeman, who to this day has not commented publicly on them, but he was fired after that Inspector General preliminary investigation.
Knowing that every single one of you guys has spoken to Freeman, I was wondering if you had any comment on what happened. Brandon?
You know, for me, it was just shocking. I couldn't believe it. I'd never seen any evidence of that, but again, I was never, you know, in that position. I wasn't a young woman. I wasn't around him in that kind of setting, and he, in our view, you know, he had done so many great things championing the Freedom of Information law that it really hurt. It stung. And the way he just walked away, you know, made me realize, wow, you know, this is just so terrible. You know, and it also reveals that someone can have such a dark side.
Yeah.
And it's just right there in plain view.
Jim?
Yeah, shocking is a really good word. I've dealt with Bob for 30 years.
Didn't he help with the Buffalo Billion?
Yeah. I probably over the years, I've probably dealt with Bob on 50 to 100 different occasions. I mean, and he was always one of these guys, you know, he talked about his wife, he talked about his kids, asked about my family. I said at some group I met with earlier today, you know, if you'd ask me to write down the names of 10 people I know in the world who would never do something like that, Bob Freeman would have been on that list. And it was really, really shocking to find out that, you know, what he had done, which is just, you know, inexcusable. And ultimately, I believe, and Brendan, you probably know better than I think one of the consequences of that is the office of the Committee on Open Government, which used to be 2 lawyers and a staff person, is now 1 lawyer and a staff person. So ultimately, we've lost an invaluable resource. And I'm sure that failure to replace Bob is by design.
You know, and another thing I would say is, you know, it was a shock to all of us, but the women we spoke to, they weren't shocked by it, and there was some kind of, you know, there was some discussion among them about Bob Freeman. And the other thing, we were able to find 3 instances where editors of newspapers were informed by their reporters that they had some sort of uncomfortable interaction. And, you know, in 3 different instances, he would pull up, he would be on the phone with the reporter, and he would pull up a picture of the reporter and say, hey, I'm looking at a picture of you, and, you know, you're very cute, or something like that. But each of those instances were at different papers, and they kind of happened in a silo. So the one editor didn't know that the other editor had been told of this, and it was just, you know, it never, everybody thought it was an isolated incident. To the point where one, Dick Moss, who used to be my editor, was a fantastic editor at the Democratic Chronicle, actually sent a letter to Bob Freeman saying, you know, listen, our reporter said she had an uncomfortable conversation with you. You've been very helpful to us, but we're very disappointed with that, and we want to put that on the record. And it was apparently just put into a filing cabinet in his office somewhere.
So what about how differently Bob Freeman was treated than, for example, the DCJS guy? You know, I mean, it seems like, why do you think that could be? Is it simply we're in the midst of Me Too, or is it something else?
I just grabbed this because I think you have to remember that Bob Freeman had been a thorn in the side of Governor Cuomo for many years because he was an outspoken critic often of his agencies. He was an ombudsman in many ways for the Freedom of Information law. And I want to say that it was probably the second floor that started putting out the word early on that, hey, something's happening with Bob. You know, I think they were happy to see him crumble and go up in flames. And it's going to be a shame if they don't infuse that office with more resources, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, just to add, I mean, it's not even just resources, right? I mean, Bob was sort of, for whatever reason, was probably because the media was so supportive of him, was insulated from the political pressure that he felt under Governor Carey, Governor Mario Cuomo, Governor George Pataki, Governor Spitzer, Governor Patterson, Governor Andrew Cuomo. I mean, think about it. What could be more different than all of those individuals? And yet he was able to do what he was doing and to stand up, in many cases, against the governor. But he never had authority. He had the bully pulpit, but he never had authority. And it was always underfunded, and it was mainly because of his work ethic that there was a lot of work got done. So I mean, this harkens back a little bit to what Jim was talking about earlier. If you can't get access to the documents in a timely time period, it's almost impossible to get government to be accountable to the public that it's supposed to serve. And the decimation now of the Committee on Open Government is going to be a serious problem down the road, because the Cuomo administration, like a lot of its predecessors, does not like to tell the public what's going on. And the law is really going to have to be changed, because there's no bite for that watchdog. There's a possibility for bark if it's somebody who's been there a long time and survived, but some new person won't be able to do that. And it's really we're going to challenge the people like me and others is going to be to figure out how can we make a real Committee on Open Government that forces the government to open its books to the public it's supposed to serve. That's not going to be easy.
And if I could just add one thing, two things are true. One, as Brendan said, Bob Freeman, as the kind of interior ombudsman, was a thorn in the governor's side, and they quickly and summarily dismissed him at a rate far quicker than they usually act on something like that. But the other thing that's true is that his actions were part of a very extensive pattern, not just with reporters, but also young fellows who were working in the governor's office or the governor's administration. And his actions were inexcusable and fireable. I mean, it was a fireable offense, there's no doubt about it. So both of those things are true.
I wanted to move on to something else that we talk about a lot, but that hasn't changed, and that's JCOPE. Blair, you have been critical of JCOPE, which is the Joint Committee on Public Ethics, since its inception. What systemically is wrong with JCOPE?
Well, this sort of comes back to the Committee on Open Government thing. I mean, these agencies are set up to do what the political establishment wants them to do, not to be independent, not to drag wrongdoers, powerful wrongdoers, before some sort of, to be held publicly accountable for their actions. And so the Joint Commission on Public Ethics, like the Commission on Public Integrity, which preceded it, like the State Ethics Commission, which preceded it, is a creature of the political establishment that created it. And they do not want it to be independent. And so, I mean, the people that have worked there, I knew Ellen Bybin when I worked in the Attorney General's office. She was the first executive director, as you all probably know. The three executive directors of JCOPE have all been former employees of the governor. An individual who is supposed to be monitored by the Joint Commission on Public Ethics. It's not about them per se. These agencies are structured to be only accountable to the politicians that pick them, not to the public they're supposed to serve. And so that criticism that we had of JCOPE goes back to then, to the very beginning, because you could read the law that created it. And the law basically said that the governor, the legislative leaders, would control this agency through their appointments. And as far as I can tell, they haven't been disappointed.
A couple more questions about JCOPE, and then we'll open up the panel for your questions. But Brendan and John, now alleged rape victim Kat Sullivan, who pressed for the Child Victims Act, is publicly accusing JCOPE head Michael Rosen of having a conflict of interest. How are you covering that allegation?
The reporter on our team, Chris Bragg, has covered this pretty extensively. And, it's amazing that after more than a dozen years of fighting for the Child Victims Act, and other states have followed suit, and some have come before New York, that JCOPE decides, with all of the important issues and corruption that they could pursue in the state of New York, they're now going to go after an alleged rape victim who took her own money and put up billboards, and she had a plane fly over the Capitol one day. I remember seeing it as I drove into work that morning, advocating for the passage. And she stood to gain nothing financially because she had settled with Emma Willard where her abuse took place. And so JCOPE is pursuing her on the grounds that because she spent more than $5,000 on that effort as a nurse that she violated the lobbying laws and failed to register as a lobbyist. And so that is what's driving Jacob these days, and even many lawmakers that might remain silent on certain Jacob cases have come out and said, you've got to be kidding me here. So,
The thing I would add too is Jacob is designed in a way that makes it sometimes impossible for reporters like us at this table to get any sort of information about investigations or whether somebody is under investigation or whether an investigation is closed, and the voting structure of the board is in a way where just one or two members of a particular party can scuttle an investigation into this or that, and really the only substantive investigations that you see come out of there are often a lawmaker who's already been convicted or quit office, and 6 months or a year later they put out some sort of report on their wrongdoing, and they're long gone from office, which isn't terribly groundbreaking. So it is designed in such a way to stumble, quite frankly.
So Blair, Kat's case has led Common Cause to criticize Jacob, arguing that regular citizen activists are not the same as professional lobbyists. Do you think that's an argument that might lead to legislative changes this year?
I don't know if that'll be the argument. I think the issue of Jacob is going to be an issue that'll come up again. I mean, people of my organization and others, including Common Cause, have been fighting to try to change that sort of setup. I think the focus on where their priorities are, I think reflects, as John just mentioned, where their heads are at. And I think that just sort of underscores the need for reform. I mean, the notion that you look at how people get paid or how much they expend goes back to an old lobby commission decision where Donald Trump was spending his own money to block casinos in upstate New York. And at the time, the lobbying commission said, and Trump said, I'm a private citizen. Now, he had an economic interest. Okay, so there's a difference, of course, because there isn't an economic interest here. But that's where the idea that an individual could spend his or her own money to influence the government requires them to report their activities. So how you distinguish between someone who has an economic interest and someone who doesn't, who's just a citizen seeking to express his or her own point of view, I think will be an issue that will come up for discussion. But once you crack the door open, it's going to be hard for them to stop an argument, a discussion over what should be the new ethics watchdog in New York State. And that may mean that they'll keep the door closed.
Judith, did you want to say anything about that? I did want to ask you and Blair one other question, which is both of you have helped investigative reporters break stories. How important is it to work with seasoned beat reporters who have an institutional memory?
Well, I think it's crucially important. I mean, as advocates or government officials, we pitch stories. I pitch stories that I think the public has a right to know, and it's not getting enough coverage, but having a reporter who is a very good reporter, who knows the history is crucial. And the fact that so many daily newspapers are losing talented reporters is a very serious problem. I think there's a relationship between the dirty politics and a dirty environment. And when you don't have the spotlight on a lot of these issues, we really do see more pollution. And kind of related to that, I do appreciate the Times Union coverage of my county executive in Rensselaer County, who is quite eloquent and spirited in his interactions with people. And I think the Times Union
He likes one adjective a lot.
Yeah. Boy, and I happen to live in Rensselaer County. What an embarrassment as a voter in Rensselaer County. But having the Times Union cover that story, I think will change local politics. I mean, with that county executive, I can't even say the words public service because he's not really a public servant. I don't know what he is, but I think having reporters have that institutional memory on local issues is just as important as statewide.
Just a again, I don't want to bore you all to tears. I spoke just before, and I don't want to overdo it. It's a late night. But just a quick story. I was involved in finding internal documents of the tobacco industry about 20 years ago, where they were reporting their lobbying activities in New York and who they were taking out to dinner and everything. It was a result of a court case. We got our hands on these documents, and I worked with reporters to get that out. And I'm not a journalist, so what do I know, right? I can barely speak complete sentences. I can, occasionally write a complete sentence, but, someone like on this panel would probably mark it up with a red pen. So to work with reporters who know how to write investigative journalist pieces and what questions have to be answered is something, it's harder for a brand new reporter to do, and it's certainly something that I don't necessarily know. I'm gonna try, but I don't have that experience. And the result of those documents becoming available led to an overhaul of the state lobbying law, banning smoking in bars, the single highest cigarette tax in the country, new fire safe standards, the first state in the country to issue fire safety standards on cigarettes, and according to the health department, a $35,000 reduction in heart attacks in New York State. That is exactly what you want investigative journalism to be doing. Saving lives, improving public policy, and protecting the public health. And the reporters I worked with were all experienced reporters all across the spectrum that were looking at that. And they were able to connect the dots in ways that I don't even know what the dots look like. And it's harder for a new reporter to do that. And the big problem we have at the state capitol is an increasing, a lack of resources, certainly on the investigative side, to look at government. And it's easy to follow the herd because your editors want to write the story of the day. And the investigative journalism can be hurt as a result. So from an advocate's perspective, where we don't make campaign contributions, we don't endorse anybody, we're not even nice to anybody, none of those things we do, right? So the only way that we try to get things done is because the media is paying attention, therefore the public's paying attention to the issues. It's much harder due to Trump world, and it's harder still because of the increasing lack of resources at the state capitol. So we think it's critically important to be working with experienced reporters.
Would love to take some questions from the audience. Daryl.
Thank you, Susan. And hello to the panelists, all of whom I know, and I work with two of you. In our discussions about Alan Calleros at the beginning, I have spoken to what I consider the four top investigative reporters in this state, all of them working for different news organizations, about Alan Calleros. He was a well-known sexual predator. This story has never come out, and I had a first-hand experience with it, not directed at me, but at one of my students when I was on the faculty at the University of Albany. And I wonder, what kept people from talking about this? It was well known, it was the biggest open secret at UAlbany. Does anybody know why every top administrator at UAlbany was so afraid of this man? I filed a report and not a word was written down. I went from
Who did you file it with?
several top administrators at UAlbany when a student disclosed to me in writing a complaint about him.
John Campbell.
I mean, what I would say is he was a very powerful man, and at the height of his power, he was, he was the belle of the ball. I mean, he worked with governors that wanted to take credit for his economic development prowess, or lack thereof. And he was somebody who was viewed as a visionary, rightly or wrongly. And because of that, he was able to build up power within UAlbany to the point where he was able to branch off and with the Cuomo administration's support, start his own SUNY campus, and become a president of his own SUNY campus.
I will tell you what a police officer at the UAlbany department told me after doing an under-the-table investigation of the complaint I filed. He said, this man is untouchable, and not even the governor could dislodge him.
Well, he wasn't untouchable because he's awaiting jail time now. So, and that is thanks to the good work of Jim Heaney down at the table here. So.
That's too bad, and it's you know.
And now he's in prison.
Right, and now the thing is, that if you know these crimes, these alleged crimes that he's committed, they haven't disappeared, you know. But people are, he's sort of done now, right? So.
But now, may I say, but what is he in jail for now? But it's not that.
He's been sentenced.
Use your microphone.
He's been sentenced, which is on appeal right now. His conviction's on appeal. So he's not in prison yet, but he was sentenced on corruption charges involving how contracts were.
Nothing to do with sexual harassment, right?
You know, the whole thing is, it's all like a Harvey Weinstein type thing, even, you know, I mean, it is. He's in a different field, but Harvey, for years, had that power. I mean, so as time goes by, we think things have changed, but it just comes back with a different face.
Yes.
So this brings up a question, and I think it goes to the heart of what we're talking about, but it also goes to the current times. As investigative reporters, you need people to talk to you, but we look at the people who talk to you, and they frequently are the ones who suffer. I mean, we're looking at an impeachment process right now where whistleblowers' life and family are threatened because they did the right thing and came forward. And that frequently happens to people who want to talk to people like you. What do you see as the kind of protections that could be put in place to allow people to be able to more freely speak and confirm the documents you find, be able to bring these stories to light?
How do we protect whistleblowers?
Well, I think it starts with the reporter thinking about the safety of the source. You know, and I think we've probably all at some point, someone wants to call you up and talk to you. You don't call them at their place of employment. You tell them not to call you from their place of employment. You don't leave any fingerprints behind. You kind of school the source on how to protect themselves. We can't, as journalists, we can't save a whistleblower from Donald Trump type tactics. I mean, that's beyond what we have the power to do. But you be mindful of the safety of the people you're dealing with.
Have any of you ever had a source get into trouble with their employer?
I had one, well, it wasn't one. Years ago, I did a story or a series of stories about the failures of the New York parole system. Dangerous parolees who were committing crimes, violating curfews, violating policies. In some cases, you know, one had beat up his girlfriend. They were not being violated and sent back to prison. And the parole officer said that the reason was because they were being encouraged to keep their recidivism numbers down, and so they were being released back on the streets. And two parole officers met with me on a Sunday at the time. We thought that was the safest time to meet. It was the only time we ever met face to face. And we talked, and based on the documents they were going to be able to get me, and like Jim said, they didn't understand the danger they were putting themselves in. Because at the time, Anthony Ellis was a state police colonel who was appointed as the commissioner of DCJS and oversaw parole and docs at that time. And anyway, so from that point forward, whenever we spoke, one of us, back then they had pay phones, remember what those are, but I used to leave my office and go to a Wolf Road hotel and use a house phone to call them. We had to communicate. We did nothing through email. And it turned out that one of the follow-up stories was that the Division of Parole used its subpoena authority, which was intended to investigate parolees, to pull the telephone and email records of their parole officers that they thought were giving us the information. Instead of correcting the problems, they denied it and then went after them. And so that's a real concern.
So I think that the point is that people aren't going to come forward if they don't think that they're going to be protected by somebody.
Indeed.
Well, and you know, it's not for me to say, you know, what kind of protection should be law or anything like that, but what I would say is I spend a lot of time thinking, and I'm sure the others at this table spend a lot of time thinking about sometimes you have to protect your sources from themselves. And you have to think about, well, if they supply me this document, how many people had their hands on this document? Will they be able to, if I post this document online, is there a mark in the margin that might give away who leaked it to me? And I'm constantly thinking about things like that, because we do protect our sources, and that is so we can get to the best version of the truth. You know, we spoke earlier about the importance of documents, and that was one of the best pieces of advice I ever got from a guy named Tom Wilbur, who was a reporter in Binghamton before I was in Binghamton.
Great guy.
Great reporter, literally wrote the book on fracking in New York. You know, I was having frustrations trying to get a source to talk, or the source didn't want to talk on the record, and he said, well, see if they can give you documents, and that's the best way to do it. But I'm constantly thinking about how to you know, make sure that I don't inadvertently reveal somebody's identity, and we spend a lot of time thinking about that.
Jim Heaney, did you want to?
No, I think they've covered it.
Okay, right in the front.
Yes, hi. My name's Brentford. I'm here from Utica with my friend Pete. We've been following a story in Utica that we can't seem to get out of the Utica media bubble. I was wondering if there's any secrets of getting your story to a bigger audience that might see the concerns that we see.
I think you need to work really hard on getting local media to pay attention. Because what happens in Utica, unless there's a broader statewide implication, you know, Buffalo's, you know, I can say there's enough graft and corruption in Buffalo. I don't need to go to Utica to find it. It's right there. So I think you need to get now in the Buffalo billion. I think it was a little bit different, in part because it was $1 billion of state taxpayer money. It was everybody was getting bamboozled. It wasn't just taxpayers in Western New York. But you need to get your local newspaper in particular to pay attention.
We're not covering it in the way that we feel it should be covered, so it's kind of made more.
Well, keep trying.
Mark.
So in the movie Lincoln, President has to strong arm Congress. So he tells his top aides, go hire me a couple of Albany lobbyists. So that was what, 170 years ago? And I've lost track of how many state legislators have been indicted since 2000 and convicted. 40, is it 50? It seems like corruption is pretty well known at the state capitol. So why haven't we been able to get rid of it?
Blair.
How do we get rid of it?
Well, you know, I mean, humans are humans. Let's start with that. I mean, as long as they're humans, there'll be devils, there'll be angels, and everybody in between. And basically, the laws are supposed to be designed to keep the people in between from becoming devils. And in Albany, you know, I mean, Wall Street's here, so there's always a lot of money sloshing around. The sort of the DNA of the political parties is very transactional. So there's that. But until there was a U.S. attorney that cared about any of those things, that's the way it was. And I can't stress this enough. The absence of somebody paying attention to what's going on at the state capitol makes people emboldened to think that they can do more. So there's no simple answer, because if there was, we wouldn't be having this conversation tonight. But it's the absence of independence independent oversight that encourages people to behave badly and allows the devils to get away with what they're getting away with, and encourages people who otherwise would not do the wrong thing to do it because they assume they won't get caught. And so the Buffalo Billion case, Percoco, Howe, Caballeros, Simonelli, all these other characters that were involved in this, none of them thought they would get caught because they thought the whole thing was sealed off from public attention. And if people hadn't been picking at it, nobody may have found out about it. And that's the problem. That's the fundamental problem, is that everything's done in the dark. No one feels that there's any repercussions for behaving badly because nobody's watching. And it's harder to get the public to pay attention to it because of all the other antics that occur in the world.
Yeah, I think it's a problem at two levels. People who have political power don't want to see meaningful reform, and therefore it's a failure of leadership. The other problem, frankly, is the voting public. Andrew Cuomo gets implicated the way he got implicated, and he won re-election in maybe his biggest margin of victory ever. So you can blame the public to a point, but the political parties are not putting up, stellar candidates either. You're kind of, it's the lesser, it's too often it's lesser of two evils. So I think the parties and the political class are at fault. But at some point, if the voting public just voted differently when there is a difference to be, when there is a difference at hand, I think that would be good too.
Judith?
I'm not sure I would blame the voting public because a lot of times you don't know what's going on, and I'm still a little surprised that other than Preet Bharara, you really haven't seen U.S. attorneys taking on big corruption cases. And why don't county district attorneys dig into this? They have some authority if the violations occurred in their counties. But I think there's just this malaise in New York, and it really tunes people out. They don't want to, they just paint the brush that all elected officials are corrupt, which is not true. Certainly some are, but most are not. But I think, you look at environmental statutes, acid rain is down by 70%. It all comes back to the environment with me. Acid rain is down 70% because we have a Clean Air Act that until the Trump administration was enforced. And here there are laws on the books, but very limited or light enforcement by the legal entities that have the authority.
Just add one thing to my story before about the records, the tobacco industry records. When that case first started to break and the lobby commission punished Philip Morris and their lobbyist Sharon Portnoy, we conveniently called it Portnoy's complaint, the case was then sent for criminal prosecution to the Albany County DA, who promptly buried it. And so the DAs are often, they're all elected, right? So they're sort of part of the operation that is dealing with what's ever happening. And that was the old sort of frame in Albany, was if you wanted something to sort of go away, you sent it over to the Albany DA. So, but in that particular case, it really was the media that drove it and forced elected officials to say, yes, I took all those free gifts from Philip Morris, but I'm going to show you how independent I am by voting the highest taxes, no smoking bars, et cetera, et cetera. But it was the Albany County DA that did that buried it.
Stephen Gottlieb?
I sort of wanted to follow up with what you've been talking about, the relationship between the public and the officials and so forth. When Blair was talking about the cigarette issue, a lot of us had the impression that a large part of why that went over the top in New York was a guy by the name of Axelrod, and his interest in it. But then when you talk about some of the DAs and the lack of investigation, except for Bharara, which Justice O'Connor, with whom I disagree on almost everything except that, was trying to promote. And I wonder if you see those connections with why is the public so blasé about it? There were people who were blasé when Nixon was impeached. I remember a letter that said, well, Nixon's guilty, but then so is everybody else. That just proves everybody else is guilty. But nevertheless, the country as a whole cared. And that made a difference.
And you think the country as a whole does not care about?
Isn't Trump proving that?
No, I would disagree with you. I think the level of outrage directed at Donald Trump because of his corrupt behavior is more intense than any sense of outrage I've witnessed in my 64 years. People are paying attention.
What did you say? People are not paying attention?
People are paying attention.
Just a quick thing on the Axelrod thing. That was the original Clean and Indirect in the 1980s. I was talking about the one in 2000 and through 2003.
Anything else about people paying attention or not, or?
Well, I mean, I think certainly on a national level, it is. I mean, listen, we have all the metrics and analytics in the world to see how many people read stories about national politics versus local politics versus state politics, and the national politics stuff is off the charts. I mean, and if that's some level, if that's some symbol of interest, I think people certainly are paying attention at the national level. It's a lot more difficult to get people to pay attention to local politics, to state politics even. And I think that probably does speak to your point a little bit. But on the national level, I agree with Jim. People are certainly paying attention.
So we're going to take a couple more questions, okay? Over here.
Yeah, so we talked about a few different things here. One of the things was, the idea of working with a seasoned investigative journalist. But I'm concerned that we're not building a seasoned investigative journalist. So, we heard what happened with Deadspin earlier this week, or maybe last week with Great Hill, kind of going under and quitting. So, what do you see in terms of kind of a new bench? We talked a little bit about local newspapers not being able to pay for the investigative journalism. What do you see in terms of new bench for that investigative journalism?
Are we building a bench of investigative journalists from younger people? Jim?
Yeah, we are. And you get to be a better reporter by doing. So as veterans go and there's a loss of institutional memory, some of those jobs are being backfilled by less experienced people who over time will gain the experience necessary to be top shelf people. Most of my hires at Investigative Post have been students right out of journalism school. And believe me, they get better. They get better quick. There are a lot of people who are graduating with degrees, a lot more people than there are jobs. So if you, and sometimes when young journalists ask me, how do I break into the business? You've got to really want it. Because if you don't really want it, you're not going to get it. I think that's more true today than it was when I broke in. So with experience comes skills, and experience and skills make for good reporters.
Anybody else?
The other thing is that you're seeing newspapers try to adapt to that. So we may not have 35 reporters who can now go cover municipal meetings and all the things that we would be able to cover through the years, but with fewer people, we're trying to do more. And I know I'm interviewing now for a state house reporter and trying to find that candidate who won't just want to follow the pack and go to the gaggles and write about this, their schedule isn't set by their inbox every day, but they need to step back and look, what's the broader story I can tell here? And in the young candidates we have, I do see that. They know, that's why they're in it.
And part of your job, and like part of Joe Spector's job, and your job, Jim, is to teach those journalists how to be better journalists.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, that's what you're doing it in the state capitol. Joe has done that with a number of different people.
Yeah, and I think if you talk to the professors in the room, I mean, there are plenty of young people, college students, who are still studying journalism and want to be journalists. And you know, the job market is tough, but thankfully we do have, you know, there is a rise in independent, you know, investigative outlets. I think Jim said earlier that it's gone from 50 to 250 in his time. You know, you have ProPublica, you have those kinds of outlets that are dedicated to investigative journalism. And Brendan was absolutely right too, in that, you know, I mean, I can speak for us at the USA Today Network. We spend a lot of time. I mean, we used to, you know, if Andrew Cuomo sneezed, we used to write a story. And we've spent a lot of time figuring out how to pull back on kind of the incremental process stories so we can focus on more investigative stories and bigger picture stories that have a bigger impact.
I don't doubt that seasoned reporters are mentoring younger reporters, but the numbers are really not good. Every few years I go to the Society of Environmental Journalists conference. I mean, every newspaper really needs a full-time environmental journalist, maybe more than one. And at this conference, I just noticed most of the people there are freelancers, or independent. They call themselves independent reporters. They have to, you know, pay their own way to the conference. There's a real change. Our son went to journalism school, even though so many people advised him not to, except his insane parents who said, great, go. And I remember talking to him. He graduated a couple of years ago, and he said of the 125 students at CUNY Journalism School, about 25 have found jobs in journalism. Now, hopefully that changed while they were out, but like that was a year out. So the numbers are not good, even though there's a lot of interest.
Regarding the pipeline, I think one positive trend is I think the quality of journalism education at the university level is a lot better than it used to be. Students are learning about data journalism, all sorts of tools, how to use all sorts of tools, and it's in some ways it's easier to develop a inexperienced reporter who's well educated when it comes to data and mapping and things like that than it is some 45 or 50-year-old reporter who is set in their ways, and it involves kind of the lazy way of doing things. And so I think there is, I think a new generation is, it's always been that way. And veterans retire and people come up and learn the job on the job. And that will continue. You know, the other issue here is, and we've let editors off easy tonight. So let me,
Yeah, we got one at the table.
well, I'm one too. But part of the problem is because of the pressure on newspapers in particular to try and do more with less. You know, there's an inclination at some papers, particularly these big chains that have a lot of small newspapers, to do the easy stuff. More sports, more entertainment, more covering of staged events that reporters can show up and cover pretty easily.
On flatbed trucks.
Huh?
On flatbed trucks.
Yeah. And some of them fall down.
Yeah.
But, you know, this requires editors with vision and with backbone to insist on the kind of coverage that results in reporters getting trained and results in enterprise reporting that gets at what's really going on at the city council or in city government, as opposed to what's going on at the council meeting every other Wednesday. And so I think to some degree, newspapers in particular are, the leadership at newspapers is failing the public, because they're in trying to deal with, there's more and more news and fewer reporters to report on. Let's just fill the pages. Let's fill the pages.
One more question that's really good from someone we haven't heard from.
Me?
Yep.
Speaking of the next generation of journalists, I am a journalism student at Albany. My name is Jackie Orchard. And I'm also the editor-in-chief of the Albany Student Press, and I feel like, I can't do a single story without media relations calling me, asking for my questions, trying to tell me how to write it, and trying to force the school message down my throat. And I've heard that doesn't really change. There's always going to be a media relations department who's trying to put out their message. So I guess my question is, how do you play nice with them and still get the information you need without it feeling like a battle of good versus evil? Because that's kind of where I feel right now.
It is a battle of good versus evil. Am I right? You need to stick to your guns. A lot of reporters, the way a lot of reporters work is, I've got a beat and I've got to deal with these people on the beat every day, and I don't want conflict because they can make my life easier or more difficult. And these days, more than ever, I think it's critical that reporters don't feel the need to be liked. You want to be respected. You want to be, my first boss when I worked in Orlando, he said, what you want to be as a reporter more than anything is feared. The people who want to obstruct you have to be afraid of doing it. And so, when people call me and they're complaining about a story, it's often, I refuse to cooperate with the reporter, and I didn't like the story. And it's like, well, let me get this right. You refuse to tell your side of the story, and you're blaming us because your side of the story wasn't told. You realize how ridiculous you sound? And so and I have that conversation all the time. It's like, so my advice to you is stick to your guns, be tough. You don't have to be nasty, you don't have to be ugly, but you probably need to be feared. It's worked for me anyways.
I want to thank everybody for joining us, and thank you to all of you for joining us on the panel. You guys are terrific.